So Mike, we work together lots on lots of really interesting water projects, but can you tell everybody else a little bit about you and your background and how that relates to DPC?
So I'm an environmental and regulatory lawyer. I head up our environment team at Burgess Salmon. But I also, in about 2012, set up the cross-firm water sector team to really focus on advice into the water sector in all different areas. And that's been very successful. We're now out for a number of water companies as well as other players in the sector.
Okay, so lots of really relevant experience for the DPC world.
Absolutely.
What would you say are the key regulatory issues when we're thinking about DPC projects?
I think the regulatory piece is really, really important. I think to understand the regulatory position for DPC projects, we need to go back and think about what are the current regulatory regime. And what you have is 5-yearly price reviews. As you know, we've just had PR24, which concluded in December. And those 5-yearly reviews are when Ofwat looks at the plans for the whole of the next 5 years, the expenditure plans, and calculates how much revenue the water company can recover from customers. And water companies will also raise finance through debt and equity, and the cost of that financing can also forms part of the price review and can be recovered from customers. But what that's meant historically is that the water companies have broadly delivered their own projects and done the financing through the debt and equity and the recovery of the costs of that. So for these new projects, which as you know have been mandated for projects that are more than 200 million whole life expenditure, number of changes need to be made to that model to allow it to work on the regulatory side. Those key changes are, first of all, Ofwat will issue what's called an allowed revenue direction, and that will allow the costs of the cap to be flowed through to customers. So that's one change that will be made. And then all the water companies have what are called instruments of appointment, and those have certain licence conditions within them that the water companies need to comply with. So there's some changes to Condition B, which is an existing condition to allow the revenue flows. But more importantly, there'll be introduction of what's called Condition U, which is a new condition to deal with DPC projects themselves. And Condition U really sets out how Ofwat are going to regulate DPC projects. And there are a number of key things that are in there. For example, Ofwat will require there's certain gateways that they've introduced where the water companies and the cap will have to go back to Ofwat and get approval to go on to the next gateway. For example, at the start of any procurement process of a cap and before entering into a cap agreement. So that will need to take place. And then the other important one is the appointment of what's called an independent technical advisor. And that is somebody independent, as goes with the name, but it's appointed by both the cap and the water company jointly, and that ITA has a statutory duty to Ofwat as well, and so they're there to oversee the project and the technical side of it, and just to protect customers and the wider public in relation to that project.
Okay, so some really key changes to the regulatory structure to provide for DPC projects as they flow forward. Sort of building blocks in a jigsaw to allow these projects to go ahead. Are there any sort of practical consequences that flow out of that regulatory change and regulatory regime that we need to consider?
I mean, it's a really highly regulated sector, as you know, and I think that is slightly different from maybe some of the older PFI style projects from previous rounds of financing. What's clear from Condition U that I mentioned is that it says that the water companies will have to continue to deliver on their other statutory obligations, and some really key ones. So, for example, there's their duty under Section 37 of the Water Industry Act to deliver an efficient and economic water supply system. There's Section 94, which is to effectually drain their area, which is provide sewerage services. There are requirements in relation to drinking water quality, environmental requirements, and so on. So they have a lot of obligations that they have to deliver on, as aside from the DPC. And I think because there isn't really a return for the shareholders involved in a DPC project, I think those water companies are going to be reluctant to take on too much risk because they're going to have to continue to make sure that they deliver on these other obligations. So I think that's really important. And I think the other thing to bear in mind is that the sector as a whole is under real pressure and real scrutiny at the moment. And I think that has an impact on how it's regulated. It has an impact on its relationship with customers and with it, you know, in the sort of political arena with a small p and a larger p. And I think anyone involved in DPC projects has really got to understand both that hard-edged regulation and also the context in which it operates to ensure that the projects go forward and risks are allocated properly and time isn't spent too long on trying to obtain things which are not going to be possible.
Yeah, so these projects can't be considered in silos. You can't just consider a DPC project on its own. We really need to think and understand the context in which they're being developed and operated in order to really understand how they're going to be go forward.
Yeah, absolutely right.